Hello Year 11, this is Lesson 6 in the Unit B2.4 on Variation and Evolution. You will need your booklets in front of you and you need to turn to the pages on the inheritance of cystic fibrosis. So that's pages 23 and 24, going on to pages 25 and 26 in your booklet. So you may have heard of this condition, cystic fibrosis. It affects around about 1 in 2,500 babies in the UK are born with cystic fibrosis, and that is normally around about approximately 10,600 people in the UK have cystic fibrosis at any one time. It is an inherited disorder. You cannot catch this disease. It is life-threatening and life-limiting, and there is currently no permanent cure for it, no way that we can permanently cure it. So to give you a little bit of information about cystic fibrosis then, it affects mainly the respiratory systems and the digestive systems, along with reproductive and skeletal systems too. So some of the symptoms are, the most obvious characteristic symptoms are a persistent cough. And this cough brings with it lots of thick, excessive production of mucus. And what that does is it clogs up the lungs, and the mucus can trap more bacteria and microbes within it. So people with CF often get persistent chest infections, which they're constantly taking a cocktail of antibiotics, in order to help clear up these bacterial infections. There can be wheezing and shortness of breath, as we said, frequent chest infections, sinusitis and nasal polyps as well. In terms of the digestive systems, it has an effect on particularly the intestines with bowel disturbances, a lot of weight loss because food nutrients aren't absorbed into the blood as they should do, and so often growth, particularly among young children with CF, is much slower. They have stunted growth, obstruction of the bowel as well, and constipation, so difficulty moving things along through the bowel. And then in terms of the reproductive systems, in men, 95% of men who have CF are infertile, and 20% of women are infertile with CF. So it means that the ability to try and have children and have a family later on in their life is reduced. And it does also affect the bones, leading to things like osteoporosis, where the bones start to weaken and thin, and arthritis, pain and inflammation between the joints. So pause the video, and I'd like you to add some of those symptoms to the diagram on the top of page 23. Thank you. So, how do we inherit cystic fibrosis, or how do people inherit it? You've got some questions underneath the diagram that you've just completed. 3 questions. It tells you that cystic fibrosis is called a single gene disorder, and it occurs if a particular gene is defective. So the first question says, suggest how a gene can be defective. Well, when we were looking at the structure of DNA and the sequence of the bases in the DNA, we said that every 3 bases is a triplet code. If for some reason one of these bases, there'd been a mistake when it had been copied, then that would alter the triplet code, which would mean a different amino acid would be made, and those amino acids join together to make a protein. So a gene can be defective because of a mistake, a mutation in the sequence of the bases. And these mutations can sometimes be what we call deletions. In other words, a whole section of a piece of DNA has been deleted. Insertions, where an extra bit of DNA has been added, or just completely altered DNA. So how common is this single gene disorder? Well, as I said, around about 1 in 2,500 babies in the UK are born with CF every year. And there's around about, at any one time, approximately 10,600 people in the UK suffering with cystic fibrosis. Because it's caused by a single gene, you do not have to have, and this gene is recessive, by the way, you have to have 2 copies of that faulty gene, okay? So the gene for cystic fibrosis, as we said, is recessive, which means only a person with 2 defective genes. So remember our definitions from previously. There would be homozygous recessive. So we'll look at how this can be inherited a little bit later. With a defective gene on one chromosome and a normal gene on the other, the person will not have cystic fibrosis, but they're described as being a carrier. So a carrier is somebody who is heterozygous for the condition. Why will they not have the condition? Well, one of the dominant non-faulty versions of the gene, allele, will always override or mask the effect of the recessive faulty version of the allele. So we've answered questions 1 and 2, okay? And question 3. It says another question 2, but it's question 3 at the bottom of the page. So let's have a look at the actual inheritance of this. So we can describe people's genotype, okay, as a combination of letters. Now, with cystic fibrosis, the common letter that they tend to use is C. It's fine to use C, but please be aware that C looks the same when it's written as a capital and a lowercase. So this is where exaggerating the size of your letters is key, so as you don't get muddled up. So a capital C is the non-faulty version. I don't like using the word normal because none of us are normal, but a lot of textbooks will describe the capital C version as the normal gene, and the lowercase c is the faulty version. So really make sure, okay, that you are being very, very clear, okay, with your capitals and your lowercases. So cystic fibrosis is caused by this faulty version. And a person without cystic fibrosis either can have 2 capital C's, okay, 2 what we call dominant alleles, and they would be homozygous dominant. We say their genotype, okay, is 2 capital C's. A person with cystic fibrosis would have to have 2 little c's, and they would be described as homozygous recessive, so they would have the condition. And a carrier is somebody who has one of each type of the alleles. In other words, a capital C and a little c, they're described as being heterozygous. So you have got your first task on the next page, on page 24, is to fill in the table, which we'll go over in a second. Just to show you, okay, how these faulty genes get passed on to a baby. So this is somebody with 2 non-faulty or normal genes, okay. They would have 2 capital C's. All of their gametes, whether they're male, if they're male, these will be sperm. If they're female, they will be eggs, okay. All of them would have the non-faulty version. However, if you're a carrier, you would have this heterozygous genotype, so 1 capital lowercase. You get 50% of your gametes, your sex cells, will have the dominant capital C, and 50% will have the recessive. So reproductive cells, sperm in males, eggs in females, are gametes, as we know. And these are different from all body cells because remember, they have half the amount of DNA. They are haploid. So they have 1 of each chromosome, not a pair. When the gametes are produced by an individual by meiosis, half of the gametes produced will have 1 chromosome from each of the chromosome pairs, and the other half will have the other chromosome of the pair. So here's our table. 2 capital C's, the phenotype would be, this would be a non-sufferer. Okay, normal or not suffering from cystic fibrosis. Description, they are described as being homozygous, dominant. Capital C, little c, This person, their phenotype is described as a carrier. They don't suffer from the condition. You would not know at all. They've got no symptoms of cystic fibrosis. They don't just have like partial symptoms just because they've got one copy of the faulty allele. So you have no idea of knowing who is a carrier. And as I said, 1 in 25 people are carriers. So in a typical class of 30, you'd expect one person potentially within that group, okay, to be a carrier. And they're described as being heterozygous. If you have 2 faulty versions of the allele, you are a sufferer of cystic fibrosis. And the description would be that they are homozygous recessive in terms of the alleles. So pause the video, make sure that you've filled that in. So, if a normal or non-suffering person and a carrier decide to have a family, first of all, they may struggle because remember, men are 95% infertile and women are 20% infertile if they have the condition. But this is a carrier and a person who does not suffer. We can predict the chances of them having a child with cystic fibrosis. So I know that this is my genotype here. I have got 2 dominant versions of the allele. But my husband actually is a carrier of CF, okay? So it has 1 capital and 1 lowercase. So when the sperm and the egg join together, this person would be deemed normal or a non-sufferer. This person would also be deemed normal or a non-sufferer, but these 2 people would be deemed to be a carrier of CF. So I've got 1 child. We don't know whether my son is, like myself, a non-sufferer and has inherited 2 dominant versions, or whether he's like his father and has inherited 1 of the faulty versions of the CF gene and 1 of the non-faulty versions, okay? This would be important later on in his life if he wanted to have children. If the other person was also a carrier, this is where you could have a child with cystic fibrosis, okay? So if we go on to the next task, so you've got this Punnett square, the normal and the carrier. Is there any chance that the children could inherit cystic fibrosis? No. You would have 2 out of the 4 would be carriers, or a half, or 50%, however you want to show it, okay? Or it's a 1-to-1 ratio. But none of them would actually have cystic fibrosis. So now I want you to fill in the Punnett square that's at the bottom of page 24, where it's got 2 carriers. So instead of this person being normal, this person would be a carrier, as well as the other person. So you need to change that to a capital C and a little c and complete the Punnett square. So genetic counsellors provide a particular role. If somebody knows that they are a carrier and perhaps their partner as well is also a carrier, their role as a genetic counsellor would be to advise couples on the risk of having children with a genetic disease. So you would want to know what the chances were and what advice you could be given. So this is one that is both carriers. So you should have filled in your Punnett square. There's our first carrier. There's our second carrier. This person would be a non-sufferer homozygous dominant. This person would be a carrier. This person would be a carrier. And this person would be a sufferer. So it gives us always a quarter, 1 in 4, or a 3-to-1 ratio. So 3 out of the 4 children would be non-sufferers, and 1 out of the 4, or 25%, okay, would be considered a sufferer of cystic fibrosis, okay? So pause the video, make sure you filled in the Punnett square at the bottom of page 24. Now, this is the first time that you've seen this type of diagram. This is called a family tree diagram, and you see them when people are looking at their relations and trying to track back their history of their family. But this particular family tree also tells us the history of cystic fibrosis and the inheritance of it. They always give you a key, and they tell you they might be coloured or they might be white and black, okay? So a woman with CF is a circle and it's dark blue. Without, it's a circle and it's pale blue. The man is a square, dark blue, and without is a square, light blue. So we're looking at a family here where Rob and Jane are the couple that get together, and they have 4 children. They have Leon, they have Claire, they have Shane, and they have Paula. And out of their 4 children that they have, they've got one of their children, Shane, has cystic fibrosis. So that should tell you a little bit about Rob and Jane's genotypes. Claire, their child, marries Owen, and Claire and Owen have 2 children, Sean and David, neither of whom have cystic fibrosis, but we don't know if they are homozygous dominant, have 2 capital C's, or whether they are heterozygous, okay, and a carrier. And Paula and Keith. Paula is Rob and Jane's son. Paula marries Keith, and both Paula and Keith have 1 child, Laura, who also has cystic fibrosis. So again, they are very similar to Rob and Jane. So look at the questions 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. Pause the video, have a go at answering them yourself first, and then I will go over the answers. So question 5, which individuals have the condition cystic fibrosis? It's Shane and Laura here. Which individuals may be carriers of cystic fibrosis? Explain why. Well, definitely Rob and Jane, and definitely Paula and Keith, because even though neither of them have the condition, they both must be carrying a recessive allele in order for Shane to inherit 2 copies from Rob's sperm and Jane's egg, and for Laura to inherit 2 recessive copies, one from Paula, who's heterozygous, and one from Keith, who's heterozygous. So question 7, what can you determine about Rob and Jane's genotypes from the tree? Show the genotypes using a Punnett square. So basically, Rob and Jane would both be carriers. And they have then a 1 in 4 chance, a quarter or 25% chance of having a child with CF. Now, depending on when they had which children in which order, every time you have a child, it's exactly the same percentage. So even if they'd had Shane first and Shane had CF, it doesn't mean that the other 3 children definitely wouldn't have cystic fibrosis, because the law of probability is that at each mixing of the DNA of the sperm and the egg, okay, there will be the same probability, the same chance. What about Claire and Owen's genotype? Show using a Punnett square. Well, Claire, we don't know, even though she hasn't got cystic fibrosis, we don't know if she's a carrier like her parents, Rob and Jane, or whether she's homozygous. Her and Owen have had a family together, Sean and David, and neither of their children have cystic fibrosis. So if Owen is definitely not a carrier, if he is like that, even if Claire is a carrier, there is no chance that Sean and David, okay, would have cystic fibrosis. Can you be certain, though, about their genotypes? Why or why not? Well, they've only got 2 children. They may have just been lucky, okay, because if Owen was also a carrier, like Rob and Jane, it may be that they just have been extremely lucky, and that 0.25% chance, okay, 25% chance of having a child with cystic fibrosis, okay, has not occurred at this point. Okay, we're now going to have a look at new ways, new therapies, okay, for dealing with cystic fibrosis. As I described, cystic fibrosis cannot be cured, okay, it can't be got rid of, but there are 2 new therapies that are still in trial at the moment, okay, and it's called gene therapy for cystic fibrosis. So we're now on page 26, and you've got 2 paragraphs that you're going to fill in. You're going to describe the difference between these 2 gene therapy treatments, and then we're going to compare the advantages and the disadvantages for these gene therapies. So the first thing we've got here is what we call in vivo, okay? In vivo means putting the gene, okay, into the cells. So we're taking what they call a transgene. Now, trans means changed or altered, okay? So they've taken a gene that has been altered and they've put it into, okay, normally a virus. Now, this sounds a little bit on the weird side, okay? Why would you purposely put an altered gene into a virus? Well, we know that viruses are very good at attacking body cells, particularly, okay, cells in the lungs. And when they attack body cells, they inject their DNA into the cell and they get the cell to make new viral particles for them, and then they burst open the cell, destroying it, causing the damage, releasing the new virus particles to infect other body cells. So you would think that this would be the last thing you'd want to do for treatment for somebody who has a respiratory condition like cystic fibrosis. But this changed gene, okay, is actually the normal or healthy gene, okay, for CF. Because the problem is that cystic fibrosis sufferers produce excessive mucus, okay, because of this altered gene. So they're going to put in the regular normal gene into the virus, and it's delivered to the site of action by aerosol spray, so a little bit like a Ventolin inhaler type thing. So it would be pumped straight into the lungs, and the idea is that these viruses with the normal gene would start attacking the lung tissue and start inserting the healthy gene into the cells of the lung tissue. So that's one method. If you want to pause the video at this point so that you can write that down before we go over the next method, okay, please do. Ex vivo means putting the genes outside, okay, of the cells. So the first thing they need to do is they need to take, okay, cells from the person's body in the first place. Now remember that these cells, because this is a person who's a sufferer of cystic fibrosis, will all have the faulty version of the gene. We grow the cells outside of the body, and then we add the altered transgene, okay, and we start to modify the cells. So we're genetically engineering this person's cells to actually become healthy, to have the non-faulty version. Once we've grown up enough of these cells, okay, a little bit like a bone marrow kind of donation, they replace the modified cells back into the body. And with the hope that these cells would reproduce, okay, and the body would have more of the non-faulty versions. So they are the two different methods. I've got a couple more diagrams just to show you another way. So this one is the in vivo. So the patient uses a nebulizer spray, okay, or as I said, like an asthma type pump to inhale the altered gene, okay, into the cells lining the airways of the lungs. They're using a liposome, okay, which is a little kind of like structure within the cell that can deliver that altered gene. So they're fatty droplets containing the healthy cystic fibrosis gene. They enter the airways, okay, to produce a missing protein, preventing the lungs becoming blocked by the sticky mucus, okay. So the liposome will enter the cell and it will prevent the excessive mucus being made. So the person still has cystic fibrosis, but they're making less of the mucus, they're getting less chest infections and respiratory system infections. The ex vivo one, okay, here we've got our cells removed from the patient. In the laboratory, a virus is altered so that it cannot reproduce. They put the gene then into the virus, the healthy gene. The altered virus then is mixed outside of the body. This is why it's called ex vivo. Ex means outside. And it's mixed with the cells from the patient. The cells from the patient then become genetically altered, so they have this healthy version of the CF gene, and then they're injected back into the patient, okay, like a blood transfusion or bone marrow transplant, okay, type thing. So here we have a table, advantages and disadvantages of gene therapy. So the advantages are clear. Cystic fibrosis sufferers can live a better quality of life. They would have to have what we call percussion physiotherapy and, as I said before, a cocktail of drugs every day to keep the infections, the bacterial infections at bay. Percussion physio is basically, if it's a young child, you put the child over your lap and it looks like you're tapping their back, okay, to loosen the mucus in their chest, okay, so they can then cough it up. If they're older, they can actually do the percussion physiotherapy themselves, so they tend to lean over and tap their front of their chest to loosen the mucus, or the back or their back to loosen it so they can cough it up and get rid of it so it's not causing congestion, and is a brilliant area for bacteria to survive in. Cystic fibrosis sufferers can live a longer normal length of life, okay, or live a longer normal length of life, okay, with gene therapy. There would be less cost spent on the medications for CF sufferers with each admission into hospital to treat each bacterial infection, and obviously less cost from time spent in hospital. Disadvantages though, okay, unfortunately this gene therapy research is very expensive, okay. Just developing the treatment per patient can cost £810,000, okay, so very, very expensive. Religious groups may not be happy with this use of gene therapy because they believe we shouldn't alter our own genes, okay. It has quite a low success rate so far, so it's not a cure-all treatment, and also will need to be trialed to check its safety, which can take many, many years, okay? So pause the video and complete the advantages and disadvantages. So I've included in the slide as well this last one. It looks very, very busy. This has just got a little bit of a summary, okay, some revision of mitosis and meiosis, comparison there, genetic cross diagrams, inheritance of cystic fibrosis, a little bit about cystic fibrosis, and also polydactyly, okay, the extra digits that we looked at previously. And at the bottom here, this is not on your syllabus, Huntington's, but Huntington's is another inherited condition, and it's actually not caused by a recessive allele, it's caused by a dominant one. So it affects the nervous system. People start to develop this in their 30s, and it deteriorates their nervous system very, very rapidly. And if you've got it, you only need one copy of the gene. And so by that point, you may have already had children and passed it on to the next generation. So that's the end of this lesson. There will be some quizzes as well appearing, some self-marking quizzes on Moodle, and I will direct you to those on Moodle. Thank you.